Hi, you're tuned in for the Power and Energy News channel ESI Africa. For this episode, I am speaking with Dom Willis, who is the CEO of SOLA Energy. Welcome, Dom.
Hi.
Right, so let's start off with the South African market, the renewable energy IPP program, and looking at the projects that have already gone through the bid rounds and are now being commissioned. They are now adding a lot of capacity to the network. Where do you see this going from here?
Yeah, really where we are now is the REAP market has been going about 12 years, and on the solar side there's been about 2,400 megawatts that's been approved and commissioned. It's on the grid. There was a small hiatus where for a couple of years where nothing really happened, but it's obviously picking up a lot now because of all the load shedding and also the commitments to the RRP. So I see the government procuring quite aggressively going forward now, as moving these programs as quickly as possible while there's this 4,000 to 6,000 megawatt gap on the grid at the moment, and that's obviously why we're experiencing the load shedding. And at the moment, from all the models, it makes a lot of sense to put renewables on because of the cost and because of the climate concerns as well. So I see the government, every year procuring, probably 1,000 megawatts of solar, probably 1,000 megawatts or more of wind for the foreseeable future.
Right, and that opens up the market quite dramatically, I imagine, for companies like yours and others as well. So let's talk a little bit about the 100 megawatt threshold, and when the announcement was made, that must have been a very exciting moment for you. You must have gone, yes, this is happening.
I think it was significant because in the history of South Africa, we've never had a situation where private energy users can buy private power without involving Eskom at all. It was possible, but at a very small scale. I mean, before that 100 megawatt announcement came out, the cap was 1 megawatt, which is it's a drop in the ocean. At 100 megawatts, it's decent scale, and you can start making quite a difference. And I think what's significant about the private market is that, where the government is procuring a lot of energy under REAP, it's a good risk mitigation to have another healthy market going, where they don't have to be involved in the procurement, they don't have to put up any financing or guarantees or anything by Treasury. It'll just happen purely on its own, and that's what the policy certainty is all about. It's just putting a decent policy in place and then allowing people to just get on with it. And I think ultimately it's going to be hugely beneficial for the country because it's going to help in just reducing that power deficit that we've got in our grid.
Exactly. And it does definitely help in terms of the capacity that we do need. But what about the technicalities behind the grid, and how is this going to impact on how we can distribute that power?
Yeah, so the grid is a critical part of this whole thing because it was actually designed a long time ago, and when it was designed there was no renewables or solar or wind or anything like that. It was basically designed to take coal-fired power and spread it around the country. And now what's happened is that all the renewables hubs are actually in areas where there traditionally wasn't particularly strong grid. So to put in context, over the next 30 years, we need to put up about 150 gigawatts of wind and solar, and a few other technologies. And at the moment, what's spare on the grid is about 27. So we need about another 100 gigawatts of grid infrastructure actually to still be built. And that's a critical thing. And I mean, the plans are obviously in place, but these things take a long time and they're expensive. So the grid is critical. There's definitely enough capacity on the grid for the foreseeable 5 years, 6, 7 years, even though there are constraints at certain nodes. There is actually enough capacity to kind of keep moving, but investment into grid infrastructure is going to be a critical part of the renewables and the future rollout of any new power projects.
No, absolutely. Let's give a little bit of a picture to a C&I customer that wants to invest in quite a considerable amount of renewable energy. What do they need to know about wheeling? Because this is a critical part in getting the energy to where they want it to be.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing they should know is that wheeling is their best friend. And it's actually an old policy. It's been around since 2009. And it's basically a mechanism where they can continue running their business exactly where it is, because that's where the best place is for their business to run. They've made that decision. But from an energy generation perspective, that can happen wherever that needs to happen in order for you to have the best benefit. So if you're buying wind power, you want to be in a windy area, and your factory might not be in a windy area at all. You might not have the space. You might have environmental sensitivities and so on. So it totally decouples where you use the energy and where you produce the energy, which is really great. And then essentially what it does is it uses the network to facilitate that trade. And thereby you can sign a bilateral power purchase agreement with somebody who's producing the power in a different part of the grid, and they can essentially use Eskom's wheeling framework, which you do pay for, but they can use that wheeling framework to produce the energy in one place and sell it in a totally different spot. And that gives you the best of everything, because you don't need to get involved with the permitting of a wind or a solar farm. You can just literally buy the energy. And the wheeling cost that Eskom charges is not prohibitive to the business case, and it's good for Eskom as well to be getting the extra revenue. Yeah.
So just talking a little bit about the tariff there, this is going to be affordable for the customers?
Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievably cheap, I suppose, and very affordable. The typical Megaflex tariff at the moment, which is Eskom's like base tariff when you blend it out, is in the region of about R1.30 to R1.40 for a kilowatt hour. So for 1 unit of energy, 1 unit on your meter if you want at home. And then in large scale, bulk wind and solar is in the region of between 50 and 70 cents, depending on the scale. And you'll pay maybe another 8 or 9 cents to wheel it to where you are. And so typically you can probably halve your electricity that you're using from the solar. So it makes significant financial sense. And then obviously on top of that, you've got the credits because it's carbon neutral electricity that you're buying as well.
Yeah, that's a plus point there. So just one last question for you, and where do you see the most exciting things happening in the market? You know, is it the Northern Cape? It's Mpumalanga? Is it Western Cape?
Yeah, I think the exciting thing is probably going to be where we start unlocking the traditional, areas that are not traditionally rich in solar and wind, because those tariffs, they go up a little bit when you use kind of worse solar radiation areas, but they're still not bad. You know, if you go to Mpumalanga and Limpopo, you think, oh, those aren't the best, but they're still probably close to double any place in Europe, you know. And what's quite nice is in those areas, there's a very strong grid, but there's also communities that need to be weaned off the reliance on coal, because coal is being decommissioned aggressively over the next 13 to 20 years. So I think that's where it's going to be quite exciting, is to get some of these projects into areas that haven't traditionally had too much. The Northern Cape is great, it's wonderful, wind and solar, but it's got no grid capacity left. They can't export any more energy out of the grid. So that's just banned, basically, until the grid infrastructure gets upgraded. But in other areas around the country, there's still quite a lot of grid capacity. So I'm looking forward to see projects materialize there. And
I think the market is definitely going to change, especially with Eskom looking at 3 business entities, and that will invest in the right infrastructure that is going to be needed as we grow the renewable energy space.
That's right, yeah, that's right. You know, the generation part of Eskom is actually the part that's in the most trouble, but the transmission network is actually in pretty good shape. And so that transmission entity will run basically on its own. And it's got a very exciting business model, actually, because it's agnostic on who it buys and buys energy from, and it just really facilitates the trade and the sale. And that's another exciting area going forward, is that the plans are in place to create a kind of an energy market where the grid is really just a facilitator of the trade. It sounds quite complicated from the outside, and it is actually quite a complicated process, but ultimately, electricity is a commodity and it can be traded at spot rates, and that, and in many countries around the world, that's exactly what happens. And this country is late to the game, but it seems like the most attractive model, I suppose, for the consumer, because you've got more choice, and more choice leads to more competition.
Exactly. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us.
Yeah, a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe to ESI Africa for more of this type of content.